Curious about nationalism? Why some proudly embrace it, others view it as a catalyst for conflict. Join us as we explore the origins, perspectives, types, and more of nationalism in this video. Stay tuned. Nationalism is one of the most commonly used and relatively broad concepts in the world of politics. To better understand this idea, it is helpful to first look at its literal meaning. The word nationalism comes from the word nation. The term nation itself is derived from the Latin word natio, meaning to birth. Thus, it can be said that historically the concept of a nation referred to a group of individuals who shared common ancestors. However, this concept has undergone significant changes over time, and today it primarily refers to a group of individuals who share commonalities in areas such as culture, ethnicity, language, history, or even geographical location. In most cases, these group of individuals are united under a common political entity, namely the state. Now that we have a general definition of a nation, we can say that nationalism is an ideology in which the concept of nation is the key issue. There is no consensus on the exact beginning of nationalism. From the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century onwards, the use of the term nation for the inhabitants of a country became more common. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the mid-18th century, radically changed the social structure of European societies. Traditional forms of identity, such as allegiance to a particular family or city and village, especially under the influence of extensive migration to cities, gave way to newer forms of solidarity that traditional affiliations could no longer define. However, perhaps the starting point of nationalist thought can be tracked back to the American Revolution and the French Revolution in the late 18th century. During this period, the inclination towards political participation and involvement in one's own destiny led the inhabitants of countries towards creating a cohesive collective identity. In fact, countries gradually moved away from being the domain of a monarch, and the people of the land, who had been considered a nation for some time, needed to come together to be able to control their fate, necessitating the formation of a new collective identity. The beginning of the 19th century spread this idea to the rest of the world. However, this idea received attention in each place for different reasons or in its specific form. During this period, nationalism was the most important factor in countries' movements towards independence and democracy. However, from the late 19th century onwards, nationalism became intertwined with ideas such as exclusivism and racism, and the concept gradually took on a form known as extremist nationalism. In the 20th century, there was two serious forms of nationalism. On the one hand, in anti-colonial struggles, nationalism was used as an inspiring element, and many countries achieved independence. On the other hand, nationalism, especially extremist nationalism, was the main factor that plunged the world into two major and bloody wars. The end of World War II largely marginalized the second form of nationalism, and except for far-right parties, no one else advocated for this form of nationalism. However, classical nationalism also lost its previous prominence in the late 20th century. Firstly, most nations in the world had managed to form their independent states, and secondly, the growth of ideas such as globalization and the general acceptance of them marginalized nationalism. Nevertheless, even though nationalism was not prominent in the later years of the 20th century, in the 21st century, right-wing parties, especially far-right parties, succeeded in reviving new waves of nationalism to some extent. Brexit, the victory of Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and the successes achieved by right-wing parties in Europe can be cited as evidence to this claim. Now that we have had a very brief overview of the history of nationalism, it is not a bad idea to delve a bit theoretically into this ideology. There are three general perspectives on the nation and consequently nationalism. The first perspective, known as primordialism, believes that nations have existed since the beginning of history. Supporters of this perspective consider nationality to be an eternal truth and in some cases believe in the connection between biological traits and nationality. However, the disastrous consequences that primordialism brought, especially during World War II, led to the decline of this perspective. In contrast to primordialism, there is the perspective of modernization theory. According to believers in this perspective, nationality is not a historical issue, but rather a very new concept that emerged during the process of modernization, with its widespread adoption in most countries occurring within the last 2 centuries. In other words, nationality is a construct that societies created during the modernization process as an identity component to help them achieve their goals. In between these 2 perspectives, there are ethnosymbolists. Ethnosymbolism, although it rejects the permanence of the concept of nationality, claims that elements such as symbols, myths, values, and traditions existed before the emergence of the new form of nationality, and nations have defined themselves on this basis. Thus, nationalism, although a modern phenomenon, is in line with a common collective understanding that connects them through shared symbols. However, from the perspective of believers in this approach, nationality has no inherent authenticity and can change over time. In addition to the 3 perspectives we discussed, nationalism has various types, some of which are these. Ethnic nationalism. One of the fundamental types of nationalism is ethnic nationalism. In this model, nations are considered equivalent to an ethnic group that usually share common ancestry, language, and religion. Historically, many countries have been formed in this manner. Civic nationalism. Also known as liberal nationalism, this model bases nationality not on ethnic unity, but on civic agreements, where people under a common government seek equal rights with each other and consider themselves a nation. Anti-Colonial nationalism. As the name suggests, this form of nationalism emerged in colonized countries. Early examples of this type of nationalism emerged in the 19th century in South America and spread to African countries under colonial rule in the 20th century. Anti-colonial nationalism aimed to unite the people of colonized countries against colonial powers and played a significant role in achieving independence from these countries. Left-wing nationalism. Marxism in particular was explicitly opposed to the concept of nationalism and advocated for internationalism. According to Marx, the oppressed workers of the world belonged to a single class, and nationalism and nations served as tools for the exploitation of the weaker classes. However, when Marxism emerged as a state ideology in the 20th century, contradictions arose. Therefore, communist countries, while still advocating for internationalism and the fight against imperialism, tried to reproduce a form of solidarity and nationalism through the creation of socialist societies. Right-wing nationalism. This type of nationalism, also known as right-wing populism, is primarily based on conspiracy theories and xenophobia. Right-wing nationalists, as their name suggests, are present in far-right parties and to some extent believe that their culture and traditions or their nationality are under attack. For this reason, they oppose any form of cultural integration with others and often consider issues such as immigration a serious problem. In addition to the mentioned models, there are other types, such as racial and religious nationalism, where nationality is based on race or religion respectively. There are also many other types of nationalism, but we are not discussing all cases here. Now that we have seen the various types of nationalism, it is worth mentioning 2 other concepts that are sometimes confused with nationalism: patriotism and chauvinism. Patriotism refers to a sense of belonging and emotion towards a country. This idea is mostly associated with sacrificing for the country and homeland. Chauvinism, on the other hand, is an extreme and irrational form of patriotism that inherently harbors hostility towards others and is usually accompanied by a belief in one's superiority. As we have seen, nationalism, patriotism, and chauvinism are relatively similar concepts that are sometimes used interchangeably. Although this distinction is not scientific, generally when using these terms, these 3 concepts are considered a spectrum, with patriotism being an approved form, nationalism being neutral, and chauvinism being negative. It's worth mentioning some criticisms of nationalism. The first criticism comes from those who generally question the concept of nationality. This group, known as cosmopolitans, oppose the division of humanity based on place of birth and ancestry. However, critics of the concept of nationality are not limited to cosmopolitans, and Marxists also have problems with it. As we mentioned earlier, from the perspective of Marx, the proletariat has no specific homeland, and nationality is a tool created by the capitalist system for further exploitation. Another criticism mainly relates to the historical background of nationalism, which has been the cause of many wars or the creation of discrimination against minorities in certain territories. Overall, nationalism is one of the key concepts in politics, and perhaps it can be argued that modern politics is more influenced by this idea than anything else. Nationalism, on the one hand, has led some countries towards independence and democracy, and on the other hand, it has been the pretext for most of the major wars in the history and has resulted in horrific crimes and genocides in the countries under this pretext. Therefore, this ideology cannot be simply classified as positive or negative. By the way, what is your opinion on nationalism? This was a brief overview of nationalism. If you found this content informative, please like it and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to share your thoughts, comments, and ideas for future topics in the comment section. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.